My name is John Castine. I'd like to welcome everyone here this evening. I teach in the English department here and I serve as principal of Brown Residential College. I'm going to open our evening with some thoughts about Brown College itself and this event before introducing the next speaker. Before we get into the substance, a few notes. First, please join me if you would. I invite you to join me in turning off your phones for a talk. I realize that may be stressful for some else. I'd like to say in advance that a video recording of this event will be available in about 2 weeks' time on Brown College's website, available for view or download, and that books will be sold by my friend and colleague Patsy from the bookstore at the book table on the side, and that following tonight's lecture, Dr. Collins will sign books downstairs. Last thing to note organizationally is that there are index cards available. If you'd like to get an index card, someone will be going around to pass them around, so hold up your hand if you'd like one. If you write a question on the note card and hold it up during the question and answer session, that's how you got it asked. Before I begin, I want to say a few words of thanks. First, thanks to all of you for being here and for demonstrating with your presence that you value the life of the mind and open discourse in intellectual community. Second, all of us here owe a great thanks to those who made this event possible, including and especially my colleagues Jennifer Geddes and Abby Margell. Jenny and Abby, where are you? Brown Residential College is a community of students, faculty members, and staff first conceived exactly 40 years ago. Prior to its opening in the fall of 1986, a group of visionary people here at UVA realized that we needed a community for students who would see no appeal in the Greek system but wanted a place to belong. This group included Bob Kellogg, Brown's first principal, who was my father's advisor in college and then mine, Carl Trindle, its first director of studies, about whom more to come, Bob Canavary, then the dean of students, Pat Lampkin and Angela Davis from the dean of students office, and Ernie Earn, then vice president for student affairs. They insisted that the residential college should house faculty members as well as students, and that the community would integrate the social, intellectual, and civic growth of its residents. It should also serve as an intellectual resource for the university as a whole, a college. The residential college is in the middle of everything, asserting through its architecture the centrality of integrated living and learning to the university's core mission of excellence in teaching. My students hear a lot from me about change and about memory. We talk about the provocations for change, the triggers that bring change about. Also about different kinds of change. Material change, for example, makes a practical, tangible difference in people's lives: food, clothing, shelter. Structural change, on the other hand, shows a culture's changing values. The statues we erect, the statues we remove, the names we use for our own group and for other groups, the names of buildings. It changes the social reality that we live in, constructed by language. With practical change alone, we might still be surrounded by affirmations of value systems we don't share. With structural change alone, we'd leave important work undone in literacy, job preparation, public health, and so on. Memory and change come together, though, in naming itself, which is both structural and practical. We're here tonight to spend time with Dr. Francis Collins, for whom the Collins wing of our medical school is now named. Like other namesakes, Edgar Shannon, Paul Gaston, Julian Bond, Isabella Gibbons, the nomenclature enshrines a set of values we inherit. These names are the genetics of the influence our students take on when they study here. Dr. Collins is here tonight to deliver the Trindle Lecture, a biannual event endowed by former students of my friend and colleague and my predecessor as principal, Carl Trindle. I will note that the people for whom these buildings are named did not ask that they should be named and suggest or demand. It's more about quietly going about doing good things, noisily asking for things. Carl's particular genius is in thinking outside the boundaries of specialization, showing students and colleagues ways to connect across the disciplines of the arts, humanities, and sciences. When I think about how to do my job well, Carl, along with Charles Matthews and Jenny Geddes, who followed him, is my model. No other faculty member has been as involved or contributed as much to the life, development, and flourishing of Brown Residential College as Carl Trindle. The fund created in his honor brings to the university innovative thinkers and writers, including theoretical physicist and novelist Alan Whiteman, Nobel Prize winner in chemistry and poet Roald Hoffman, science philosopher and novelist Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein, and environmental and human rights activist and writer Rebecca Solnit. Please join me in welcoming Professor Carl Trindle, who will introduce his former student, Dr. Francis Collins.
Whenever I look around this particular room, I feel the presence of greatness. You know who you are. And tonight we had a first-time visitor to this particular room, Francis Collins, but I want to say a few words about what the room evokes for me. Dearly beloved, we're gathered here to take a step along the road to wisdom. And we can derive wisdom by contemplating an exemplary life. The life I describe now refers to a man born in mid-century, not very far from here. In his early youth, he learned from his family, from surrounding authorities, and from spending time in the valley. He was studied by gifted tutors. He played several instruments and took a lifelong pleasure in music. We'll hear about that this evening, and more than casually. He pursued more formal education at the foremost institution of learning in Virginia. He studied mathematics, sciences, read widely in a broad array of the humanities. As was necessary in a rural setting, he had grasped the importance of rough and ready medicine and the good effects of vaccination. He will forever be associated with one of the most important documents in history. Formed in collaboration with the best minds of the day, and not without serious conflict, it carries authority across cultural divisions. One might say it's revolutionary. Now, despite his many travels, he always returns to his Virginia home. In fact, he seems to be with us even now. Just in case I've been less than straightforward, I should say our guest this evening is actually Francis Collins. He's alive even now, and not just symbolically. In his early years were spent with his family on farmland near Staunton, Virginia. His formal studies of physical sciences, including years at the University of Virginia and Yale University's chemistry department. Through the textbook biology of his early years seemed less than compelling, a molecular biology course that he took at Yale while studying quantum mechanics changed his mind, opened his eyes. His interests could no longer be confined to a handful of atoms. The developments in human genetics, based on the discovery of the DNA structure, a chemical problem, I say, and the new techniques for its manipulation, recombinant DNA, held out promise for new power over the genetic material. In medical school, he saw what courage and comfort people derive from religious faith. In what might be imagined to be a miracle, a pastor led him to C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. This turned his attention to the noble task of finding the mutual supports that reconcile scientific and Christian thought. His scientific efforts through the 1980s contribute to understanding of the genetic basis for cruel and debilitating diseases, made him an ideal shepherd for the massive efforts through the 1990s that led to the decoding of the human genome. I think it's no exaggeration to call that revolutionary. Unlike many a revolution in history, it required cooperative efforts by many gifted actors and many well-developed egos. Balancing and extending this work was his publication in 2006, The Language of God. This seems aspirational, but it met with an enormous response. The response to this disarming and convincing work was enormous. It spurred Francis to found BioLogos, devoted to exploring and easing the tensions between science and faith that many see as impossible to resolve. As we see, reconciliation is a through line in Francis Collins' body of work. Respectful engagement across disagreements was essential to his leadership of the NIH for 3 presidents, Obama, Trump, and Biden, and negotiations as well with rather heterogeneous legislative bodies. Francis Collins has let loose the reins at NIH and now looks back on his experience. We can benefit from his exemplary life. In The Road to Wisdom, he leads us toward constructive engagement across what seems to be an unbridgeable chasm of disagreement and even enmity. A conciliatory approach has been put into practice by a remarkable movement, Braver Angels. We'll hear more about this, I feel sure. I'm confident in predicting, it's very hard to do, especially about the future, but that after this evening's thoughts, we'll see a path beckoning us forward toward deeper understanding. Francis Collins.
Carl, I've had many introductions in my experience. None, I think, that captured the swath of experiences that I've had the privilege of having, as well as yours. So maybe I should just sit down because he's already introduced most of what I had to contribute, but I might add a few little details to it. It is a great honor to be here in this exquisite space, in this university that has played a critical role in the formative years of my life. And it's also part of my family. I have 3 other brothers. All 4 brothers have Wahoo-Wah in their DNA. My oldest brother, Christopher, Kit, is here with his wife, Susan. And we will have all 4 brothers gathering at Burton's on Saturday for our annual get-together to share stories, because we're all pretty close to Charlottesville. I came here as an undergraduate at age 16 in 1966. I walked onto this campus wondering whether this was a place where I was going to feel at home, and rapidly did so, despite some of the circumstances at the time, which students today may find impossible to imagine, namely that we were forced to wear coats and ties to class. And Saturday classes at 8 a.m. were a routine. Imagine that. Things changed a little bit during my 4 years. They let women in, which I thought was really wonderful. And then in 1969, we had all kinds of protests, and we shut the campus down, and somebody thought we were going to burn the place down. It was like amazing transformation from being very under control to out of control. Fortunately, I think we found a better balance along the way between those things. But it's a joy to be here and to meet with students, which I was able to do today, and hear your perspectives of what it's like here, and to have you ask me some pretty penetrating questions about this book that you were forced to read. No, you loved reading it, right? And you had some really good points that I will remember and think about. And yes, there were at least one or two people who said you should have written a different book instead of this one, so maybe I'll work on that the next time around. So given this title, which you see here, Science, Faith, Music, and the Road to Wisdom, that kind of sounds like that covers an awful lot of an undergraduate education. I will do my best in maybe 35 or 40 minutes to cover some points there, but then we are going to come to the point of your questions. And so again, there are index cards out there, and please don't wait until the end. You can start putting those down. They'll get collected, and Jenny will read through them and hand the ones to me that are most legible would be a good start, but maybe also most penetrating in terms of stirring up a conversation. So here's what I want to do. We're going to start with my own journey in science, although you probably have heard quite a bit of that now from Carl's wonderful introduction. And on top of that, I thought it would be appropriate to talk a little bit about my journey in faith as well, because that's in the title, and it's a big part of who I am. I will have to talk about the current state of our nation and our world, because I don't think anybody in this room would say everything is going well right now. Maybe a little bit here and there, but some things are not. Some reflections on how we got here, and some exhortations about how to find our way back, and then your Q&A. So to begin, my own journey in science. That's me. That's Shenandoah Valley. That's a farm outside of Stanton. I think I'm probably 8 or 9 years old. That's the barn in the background. That's where I grew up. I was homeschooled by my parents until the 6th grade because they thought they were better teachers than what Augusta County had to offer. And I think they were probably right. But then we moved in town to Stanton, and I got to go to public school starting in the 6th grade. And I think I got the best of both worlds. I learned from my mother how to love the experience of discovering something new. She was so good at conveying that. I don't think our school situation had much in the way of a lesson plan. It was like, what's interesting today? Let's talk about that. Let's work on that. Let's pursue that. Maybe we do math for like 3 days in a row because it was interesting, and then it wasn't, so we'll do history. And after that, well, maybe we'll do languages, or maybe we'll do literature. My mother was a playwright. My father, a drama professor. They started a theater in the grove of oak trees up above our farmhouse, which is about in the next 2 or 3 months to have its 73rd consecutive summer season. So durability, they managed to instill in lots of other folks who are now part of that. So this is a great way to grow up. I loved learning about things. When I got to high school, I landed in a chemistry course that absolutely lit up my enthusiasm for this is what I want to do, because it was explaining what science is. Science is a detective story. There's truth to be discovered about nature. And you have these tools in the science lab that give you a chance to discover that truth. And yeah, you can get it wrong sometimes, but it tends to be self-correcting if you keep at it, because there is real objective truth to be discovered. And I thought, this is what I want to do. And so I went off to the University of Virginia to learn how to be a chemist, because I figured that's what it was. And along the way, I bought a guitar, and I was trying to make the best of the fact that I was socially inept, and managed to join a bluegrass band here in Charlottesville. And we played at the Prism a few times. One of my bandmates, Kathy, is right here. We should have a little jam session after this. But no, being here at the University of Virginia was an amazingly wonderful experience for me. But I was not interested in life science, as you heard. It's too messy. I want to stick to physics and chemistry and a lot of mathematics. And that's where I spent my time. And then I got to be a senior, and I wanted to do some research of my own. And there was this professor who had just arrived that year from Yale University, and he was studying the kind of chemistry that I was most interested in, which was quantum mechanics. And so I went and knocked on his door, and somehow, being green as I was, he decided to take me on. And that, of course, is Professor Carl Trindle, who just introduced me. I was his first student. And what a lucky guy I was to have that experience, learning how you actually tackle a problem that hasn't been solved yet and see what you can do to contribute to it. My first paper, if you go to my bibliography and look, what is reference number 1? This is it. Trindle and Collins, Energy-Based Formalism for the Mapping Analysis of Concerted Reactions. I hope nobody would ask me right now to explain what that means, because it's been quite a while. But yeah, this was what I got to work on, and involved a lot of time with computer programming, basically trying to take chemical reactions and understand them in terms of topology and to program them so that you could see how something happened that previously was described, and there were some rules about what worked and what didn't, but this was a way to see it in a whole new light. I loved that. So off I went to Yale to get a PhD in physical chemistry, just like my mentor had done, and landed there, enjoyed very much the experience of digging even deeper into a lot of the math. My main research effort was with computer programs as well as pencil and paper, trying to solve really hard second-order differential equations. But at night, when I was working, there was a student in another lab that I would talk to, because he was there working too, and we both would take a break, and he would tell me about what he was doing. And he was in the Department of Chemistry, but he was studying a particular chemical. That one, DNA. I didn't know anything about this, and he began to tell me what they were up to. This was right when recombinant DNA was being invented. So you could not only describe the molecule, you could actually start to do some rearranging of it. And that just seemed incredibly exciting. And I thought, how did I sort of block this out of my own personal experience? So I did take this course and learned a bit more about what is going on with nucleic acids, and I got totally captivated and figured, okay, I think I'm still young enough to make a change in my life plan, even though at that point I was married with a small child, and decided, somewhat to a surprise of everybody, that I was going to try to finish the PhD and then go to medical school. Now, why the University of North Carolina Medical School Admissions Committee listened to that story and said, okay, you can come here, it's not quite clear, but they did. And so I landed there. And yeah, for a guy who hated to memorize stuff, this was a bit of a stretch, but just the same, it was memorizing stuff that I could really attach myself to. And one of the first things that happened in that medical school course was a 2-week course on genetics, taught by a pediatrician who brought patients to class, patient with sickle cell disease, a girl with Down syndrome, an adult with neurofibromatosis, a baby with an inborn error of metabolism called galactosemia. And he could explain what the features were, but also that these were all caused by misspellings in DNA that we are increasingly able maybe to recognize and maybe someday do something about. Well, that felt like a someday I wanted to be part of. And so as early as halfway through my first year of medical school, I decided I want to be a medical geneticist who brings together the skills of the physician, but a researcher who can focus on how to find answers to these thousands of genetic disorders that are mostly inscrutable, at least they were at that time. So I went through the rest of the training, that is 4 years of medical school, 4 years of residency, 3 more years of training in molecular biology, because I had to learn how to do the bench part of this. My quantum mechanics was not helping me figuring out how to do a biology experiment. And then finally, it got to be a real job as a University of Michigan assistant professor. And my goal at that point was to try to find the causes of some of these genetic disorders that were causing a lot of distress, but we didn't know much about it. So I guess, yeah, I could be called a gene hunter there in Ann Arbor. And it was hard. We were chasing the gene for cystic fibrosis. Nobody knew where it was, except gradually it began to be something on chromosome 7. And people would come up to me and say, have you found it yet? And this got a little old. And so eventually I said, I got to have a visual. So Michigan has lots of haystacks. I found one. And I got a needle from my wife's sewing basket, and I went and sat in the haystack and held up the needle and said, okay, do you get it? That's how hard it is to try to find what might be one misspelled letter out of 3 billion without the tools to know how to do this. Because in the 1980s, this was brutal. It took years, a lot of burned out postdocs and graduate students. We didn't have a genome project at that point. We didn't know how to sequence DNA except a few letters at a time. There was no internet. I mean, imagine that, those of you who are more recently arrived on the scientific scene. It was tough. But, ultimately, with persistence, on a rainy night in May 1989, there it was. 3 letters, just 3, that were missing in 90% of patients with cystic fibrosis. Sorry. And led us to believe we had the answer. It is a joy for me to say, here now, some more than 30 years later, that any cystic fibrosis patient that had that 3 base pairs missing now has access to a therapeutic, which took 30 years to develop, much of that with taxpayer-funded research through NIH, that now allows them to plan for retirement instead of an early funeral. It's one of the more dramatic and amazing advances that has happened. It takes a long time, but it took thousands of people working in various parts of our ecosystem that involves NIH-funded basic research at universities like this one, and then philanthropy, and then pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies, and it works. And we in this country have been the envy of the rest of the world. At least we were until a year ago. I'll come back to that. So we had the answer to cystic fibrosis, and then others that I got to work on, the Huntington's disease gene. This is Nancy Wexler, who was such a leader in that, and we found that particular misspelling. And this is neurofibromatosis, a little boy with that. Rather common disorder, but it doesn't get much attention because it's disfiguring. And more recently, been totally devoted trying to find an answer to this rare form of dramatic premature aging called progeria. And that boy that you see there in the picture with me and Cookie Monster, that is Sam Burns, who at the time the picture was taken was 15. Sam died a year after that of heart attack, as most kids with that disorder have done for the time that we've known about them, but it is an extremely rare condition. We found a drug for this that now has many of these kids living into their 20s, but it's not good enough. And we're now on the path towards an in vivo gene editing cure for this disorder as soon as the end of this year to administer to the first patient. Fingers crossed that this can work. And this disease is caused by 1 letter misspelled out of 3 billion. Always that same letter, a T that should have been a C in the middle of exon 11 of a gene called lamin A, remarkably similar. So all of that has been quite a ride in its own right, but then I got asked to be the guy to lead the Human Genome Project, as you heard about. And initially I thought, this is not something I'm going to want to do. It means giving up my wonderful experience in a university and becoming a federal employee, which is something my mother told me never to do. But it was the Human Genome Project, and it might even work, and how can you step away from that kind of opportunity? And so over the next 10, 15 years, that's what I did. I was happy because of the remarkable contributions of an incredibly talented group of people that we did, in fact, succeed at this. In fact, we succeeded not just on time, but 2 years ahead of schedule. And that's a testimony. 2,500 scientists, 6 countries, 20 institutions who basically put their shoulders to the same wheel and made all the data immediately accessible to anybody who wanted to look at it. That was a real change in the way in which data access was being handled up until then. And there it was. And then a lot of us have been spending a lot of time since then trying to figure out how to read it. This strange language with just 4 letters in its alphabet. And inside each of your cells, you've got 3 billion of those times 2, 3 from mom, 3 from dad. If you piled up on a printed copy of that, all the pages, from 1 cell in your body, that would be about as tall as the Washington Monument. And every time the cell divides, you got to copy the whole thing. It is just inspiring of awe to think about this. As it is inspired to think that you all started as 1 cell with that genome copy there. And look what happened. It's all biologically somehow written in to that strange four-letter code to develop something as amazing as a human being. So I kind of thought maybe I would move on to something else, and then President Obama had another idea, and I was asked to come back to NIH as the director of the whole thing in 2009. And somehow I kept getting reappointed, which isn't supposed to happen. All previous NIH directors turn over when the president turns over. But I ended up staying on with Trump and then again with Biden for 12 years. And it was a different kind of experience. As the NIH director, you preside over 27 institutes and centers, each of whom is led by a really remarkable, distinguished, visionary scientist. And the budget goes to those institutes and centers, not to you as the director. So your role is to try to cajole people into working together on something that isn't quite happening yet. And there are plenty of examples where that could happen. So one was to create a whole new center that would take some of the basic science that was sort of stuck and move it towards the clinic, what you call translational science. That has been a big new part of NIH's efforts that I think has made a lot of these advances happen more quickly. Another was the BRAIN initiative, because we are at the point now of having the kind of technology that really has the promise of figuring out how those 86 billion neurons between your ears do what they do. It's the most complicated structure in the known universe, as far as I can tell. And you're just walking around with one of those. And we don't really understand exactly how are those functions happening. But we're going to figure it out with a lot of new technology. And a lot of this is beginning to emerge in ways that are going to have powerful implications for diseases like schizophrenia or manic depressive illness or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or autism. And then there was this effort that I felt pretty powerfully about. Let's try to figure out not just why do people get sick, but how do they stay healthy? And that must be a combination of environmental influences and genetics and health behaviors and decisions, and all those issues fold into that. But you're never going to figure it out if you study one person here and one person there. You need a huge prospective long-term study of lots and lots of people, let's say 1 million, and people who are willing to be partners in this and share everything about what they're doing, their diet, their exercise, their medical records, having their genome sequenced. That's called All of Us. And that program has now enrolled 880,000 people. I am curious, is there anybody here who's a member of All of Us? I got one, and I'm one, and Diane's one. So, and it's not too late, because we're not quite to 1 million. So if you're interested, joinallofus.org. You can be part of this big adventure and already shedding a lot of light into us about the combination of genetics and environments and what it all means. And I was very excited also to see, as this genetics guy, that we were not just using genetics to do a lot of sequencing and make diagnoses, but we could also use this therapeutically. And having studied sickle cell disease when I was a postdoc, to have this turn into a curable disease in my lifetime is not something I thought would be possible. And it has been possible, and we are there. And that is such a phenomenal testimony to the hard work of years and years of research efforts to try to figure out how you could take that one misspelled letter and figure out how to fix that in the bone marrow, which is where red cells are made and what has to be fixed. And you talk to some of the people whose lives have been totally transformed by this experience. And if that doesn't inspire you and make tears come to your eyes, I don't know what will. And that's one genetic disease. We've got thousands more that we're on the trail of going after. And then I ended up in the White House for a year, which I hadn't expected either, as the science advisor to President Biden. And that was also an interesting opportunity to look for another place where something needed to be done about human health that wasn't happening. And tomorrow, when I go to the Batten School, I will talk about what that was and where we haven't quite solved it yet. And that's hepatitis C, a disease for which we have a cure, a really good cure. 1 pill a day, 8 to 12 weeks, 95% cure. 4 million people in this country do not have access to that cure. That is wrong. And we have to figure out a way to fix that. And I think there's a pretty good pathway to get there. It just requires politics, which right now is a little complicated. So that's a quick romp here through things that I had the privilege of doing as a scientist, but I also promised I would say something about my faith perspective, so let me quickly tell you about that. How did I come to be a Christian? When I was here at UVA, I was not. I was agnostic, I think, but I was trending towards atheism. Yeah, I did play in the band that did the 5 o'clock service at St. Thomas Church because it was fun being in the band. And I got actually to be pretty good friends with Father Stickle, who was the father who oversaw the place and was a wonderful human being. But did I believe any of that? No. It was interesting culture, and that was about it. I would have occasional moments where I'd have this sense that I was missing something, but not enough to slow me down for long. Then I went to medical school, and I had to sit at the bedside of good, honorable people who were facing the ends of their lives, and I had to wonder, how will I handle that? And I wasn't sure I had very good answers. And I had a particular patient who had really bad heart disease, who would share her faith with me when she was getting over one of her bad heart episodes. And I would listen awkwardly, not knowing what to say. And at one point, she simply turned to me and said, "I've shared my faith with you, but you never say anything. What do you believe, doctor?" Simple question, huh? I realized I had absolutely no answer. Yeah, at that point I would have said I'm an atheist, but I didn't know why. It was kind of the answer I thought I was supposed to have as a scientist, and it meant I didn't have to think about it. But she was asking me to think about it. And I said, "I don't really know." And she looked at me, this look like, "What? You're a doctor? You're supposed to be so smart about all these things, and you don't even know what you believe about the question of whether God exists? What?" That bugged me. I figured I've got to go and strengthen my atheism and do some better work on this here. And I did find this pastor down the street from me in Hillsborough, North Carolina, and knocked on his door and asked him a whole bunch of blasphemous questions. And he was incredibly gracious about the whole thing. And eventually took this book off his shelf and said, "Maybe you ought to try reading this, because I think it's written by somebody who's gone through what you're going through." And yes, that was C.S. Lewis. That was Mere Christianity. That very first chapter, entitled "Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe," just completely knocked me over. I never really thought about right and wrong as a clue to anything other than the fact that I probably wasn't doing it very well. So I struggled with this. I was not a pushover. It took me 2 years to really finally come to the conclusion that faith made more sense than atheism, but it was a long run. But part of that was actually going back to my own love of science and seeing there were some pointers there to God. First of all, there is something instead of nothing. Science can't really help me understand that. And if you have a scientific answer to that from Larry Krauss or something like that, we can talk about it, but I don't think it holds up very well. It requires an awful lot of faith. There's something instead of nothing. The Big Bang happened, and nature came out of nowhere, and somehow the universe behaves according to mathematics. All the math I did in my PhD, those second-order differential equations, they describe truth about how matter and energy behaves. Why should that be? That seems like there's a mind behind this, doesn't it? And a mind that's capable of creating something out of nothing at the Big Bang, because nature hasn't done that. So that feels kind of supernatural. Whoa, okay. And then there was this real doozy, which still astonishes people. And when I debate with Richard Dawkins about faith, he admits this is the toughest one for him to dismiss. And he doesn't admit that easily. So this is the fine-tuning. You know, those physical laws that determine how matter and energy behave. They're beautiful equations, and you know you've got it right when it's beautiful. But they have constants in them. You can't derive the value of the constants from first principles. Take gravity. It's an inverse square law. So m1 times m2 over r squared times g. Well, what's g? G is the gravitational constant. And we know that now to a very precise value, thanks to some really good experimentalists. But we couldn't have guessed what it was without doing the experiment. So suppose we lived in a universe where g was a little different. You might think, oh, well, that would be interesting and not all that relevant. If it was just a little bit bigger or smaller, we might notice. Actually, the whole thing doesn't work anymore. If gravity is as much as 1 part in a million stronger than it is, the Big Bang ends up in a big crunch before anything interesting can happen. And if it's 1 part in a million smaller, things just fly apart and never really coalesce into stars, galaxies, planets, and anything interesting at all. And that's not gravity alone, that's at least half a dozen of these constants. And they all have to have exactly the value that they do, or there's nothing that you would point to say has anything interesting about it or any kind of possible life. Is that just good luck? Well, it can't be good luck. Maybe it's good luck that we're in the one universe out of an infinite number of other universes that have different values. That's the multiverse hypothesis. Will we ever be able to measure those other multiverses? I don't think so. So that sounds like an opportunity for faith. Or else you say there's an intention here. There's a mind, an amazing mind, and a desire to have a universe that's interesting, and maybe even that would result in large-brained creatures like the people here at the Rotunda this evening. It's hard to ignore those arguments. They don't bring you to proof. I don't know of any proof of God's existence, but there's certainly things that make you wonder about it. And then, in terms of what kind of God is it, coming back to C.S. Lewis and the moral law, why is it that all human populations down through, as much as we know about them, have had this sense that there is something called good and something called evil, and we're supposed to do the good stuff, even though we often fail? Now, we disagree about what belongs in the good column and what belongs in the bad column based on our culture, but we don't disagree about the fact that there are those two columns. Where does that come from? Because sometimes that seems to call us to do things that are actually not consistent with passing on our DNA. Sort of radical altruism flies in the face of a simplistic explanation of the moral law. I found that intriguing. And then there was one other pointer that I hadn't thought about, but it also is fairly compelling, and that's the whole concept of beauty. Why is it beauty is so important to us? Why is it can lift you out of a moment where you're having just sort of an average day and something happens? Maybe it's a beautiful image, maybe it's music. For me, it's often music. And you suddenly feel this sense of being transported, that you're longing for something, but you can't quite say what it is. It is acute, it's poignant, it's almost painful, but it is the sweetest thing that you can imagine. And then pretty soon it's gone. And you feel like, that's a pointer to something. So the moral law and beauty both seem to me to be pointers to a God who cares about me. And as I studied all those world religions trying to figure out how do they interpret this, I recognized they had an awful lot in common with each other. But ultimately, I encountered the person of Jesus as someone whose life was remarkably well documented and couldn't be dismissed as I had done as a myth, and who also made claims that were hard to dismiss either, like being the Son of God. And after 2 years of fighting against this with everything I had, somewhat reluctantly, I could resist no more. And I fell on my knees in the dewy grass in a wonderful hike in the Cascade Mountains in the northwest of this country and said, I give in. That was 48 years ago. And that has been, with some doubts here along the way, some uncertainties, because that's part of faith as well, an incredibly happy part of my existence. And one which I might say I have never discovered conflicts with what I know as a scientist, as long as we're clear about what kind of question we're asking, whether it's a scientific question or a faith question. And yes, it adds more to my experiences of beauty. This is the National Symphony Orchestra in Washington, D.C., playing the second movement of Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Eroica, which will never fail to bring me to tears, although I don't quite know why. I grieve a little bit more in tears that the National Symphony Orchestra now does not have a home. And beauty appears in other places too, in science. I love this comparison of images. On the left, a rose window, this one at York Minster, but you've seen many of them in cathedrals. On the right, that's DNA. But instead of looking at it from the side, You're looking down the barrel of the DNA, the long axis, and seeing this beautiful radial pattern. Anyway, all of those experiences I wrote about because it seemed to me a lot of other people were struggling with how to put science and faith together. And that was in this book called The Language of God that Carl very graciously mentioned in the introduction, which has surprised me that it seems to have actually found a place in a lot of bookshelves of people who are interested in having this conversation. And then that led to the founding of BioLogos as an ongoing way for people to have this kind of discourse about how faith and science fit together. If you don't know biologos.org and you're interested, have a look. There's a couple million people that regularly traverse that site. They run meetings. I'm now a senior fellow at this organization, and I'm having a wonderful time seeing the way in which, in this current climate, a lot of people are interested in coming back to those discussions. Well, then let's move to the current state of our nation and our world. I think we can all agree we got a serious kind of divisiveness and polarization that's happening. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't just start with COVID, but I think certainly some of the things that happened during COVID seem to have further driven us apart, which is a true tragedy because we had a common enemy there. It was called a virus that might have drawn us together, and maybe it did for like a couple of months in 2020. But then we started to have disagreements about what was the right way to approach this. The communication about it was flawed. I'll take some blame for that myself. We failed to tell people sometimes how uncertain we were about the conclusions because this was a developing story with a virus that we were learning something new about every day, and oftentimes it was not good news. And all of that ultimately led to a circumstance where an already divided public tended to take sides about whether to trust the science about COVID or not. Social scientists have studied American societies, and they would conclude that while we are divisible, in their view, into these 7 categories, that most of the attention comes from the wings, that being the progressive activists and the devoted conservatives. But most Americans don't live there in that roughly 15%. Most are in the middle categories and are, I think, fairly described as the exhausted majority. They're just fed up with all the animosity. Some of you feel like you belong there. I feel like I belong there. Fed up with all of the messages of anger and fear inductions and recriminations and claims that turn out not to be true. And they've kind of just sort of checked out. So how do we reach them again at a time where they're probably our best solution to get back together again? The fringes are to the point, though, where if you're in the fringe, you don't just imagine that the people on the other side are wrong. You imagine they're evil. And you imagine that in order for things to go well, it isn't enough for you to win. They have to lose. It's kind of adopting that, sort of this New Yorker cartoon with the 2 dogs in the bar saying it's not enough that we succeed, cats must also fail. I think I've seen that in some political discussions. There was no more dramatic demonstration of just how much this has disrupted our society than what happened in COVID. Settled science about the vaccines for SARS-CoV-2. This is based on all the evidence. Well, they were developed and tested in record time, 11 months. The results of a really rigorous double-blind randomized trial that I had a lot to do with, and I didn't sleep much in 2020. Serious side effects, quite rare in that group of 30,000 people, 92 to 95% effective in preventing serious disease, hospitalization, or death. Much better than anybody would have thought possible for a coronavirus. And another settled fact, about 3 million lives, maybe a little more, saved by vaccines in the US. That's Commonwealth Fund numbers. Of course, we don't know who those people are. Maybe one of them's me. I got my vaccine. Might I not be here if I hadn't? I don't know. But you can look at the way one does the epidemiology, and that's about the right number. And the number for the whole world is somewhere between 14 and 20 million lives saved. Those are facts. And yet, in the United States, more than 50 million people said, no, I don't want that vaccine. I don't trust it. It was developed too quickly. Maybe there's something in the syringe that shouldn't be there. I'm going to just wait this one out. And more than 230,000 people died unnecessarily. Our culture wars killed 230,000 people because facts were overtaken by other kinds of information. That's not my number, that's Kaiser Family Foundation. And that distrust has continued and even multiplied to the point now where those mRNA vaccines, which were the reason for all those lives saved, are now considered by leading figures in the US government as no longer appropriate to invest in because they might be dangerous based on, as far as I can see, only a small bit of evidence about 1 in 10,000 individuals who develop myocarditis from mRNA, virtually all of whom spontaneously recovered. That's the only safety signal for mRNA that has held up. And that's a serious one that we have looked at very hard. But to compare that to millions of lives. If we have another pandemic, folks, mRNA was going to be our best chance for a quick response. And now China will do that, but we probably won't have access. So how did this happen? How do we get here? How do we, in our society, the most advanced technological country in the world, how do we end up being lost this way? Well, I think we lost some anchors. And let's talk about which ones. First of all, truth. I wouldn't think I had to come to a university and say there is such a thing as objective truth. And I don't think I have to say that here. But there's certainly lots of discourse going on in places, and some of you will see it every day in social media, where it's okay to say, well, that might be true for you, but it's not true for me. That would be okay if you were talking about an opinion out there on the outer circle of my levels here of information. But if you're talking about established fact, I'm sorry. They don't care how you feel. And it's not okay to reject one because you don't like it. But increasingly, that seems to be an acceptable point of view. And I am not a fan of the way in which social media has fanned that flame. So yeah, these circles. Necessary truth, by the way, is just pure mathematics. That's about the only thing I can think of that would be true in any universe. Firmly established facts, those are the things we've worked so hard to establish by many years and decades of hard work. A lot of it's from science, some of it's from history, some it's geography, but we know these things to be true. Those are not ones to mess with. And then there's that zone of uncertainty, which is a lot of what science is into right now, trying to take something in the zone of uncertainty and make it firmly established because you finally figured out how it worked. But so many times when we're having these conversations and disagreements, people forget about which circle they're in. And the rules ought to be different if you're in an opinion circle as opposed to the firmly established fact. Science is a critical way we fill in the firmly established facts. That's a picture of my former lab in front of our building at the NIH campus. Wonderful, amazing scientists working on diabetes and that rare form of premature aging. Yeah, science makes mistakes. We have certainly made conclusions in my lab that turned out not to be true after we replicated the study and realized, oh, I guess we had a confounder or something weird happened there. So you've got to do replication. But it is ultimately self-correcting, and it does discover truth. We're in trouble, though, here in the United States, with medical research at risk, despite the stunning record that you can see on the slide. But now with major proposed budget cuts, thousands of grant terminations, thousands of scientists being let go, and research universities losing federal support across the country, a lot of the progress that we were counting on has now been slowed down. And I don't think most Americans are really aware that that's happening. I don't think they have a good sense about why medical research matters. It's a long, slow process, and when a breakthrough happens, did you really recognize what the course of events were that got you there? Or is it, oh, that company made a great finding? We need to work on this harder. I am totally focused right now on a project which has a code name, because it's temporary, called Project Chronicle. And what we're trying to do is collect hundreds of stories from patients whose lives have been profoundly affected by medical research funded by the taxpayers and who are ready to tell that story in a fashion that is social media ready, which means it's got to be 1 minute or less. And it's got to catch your attention in the first 5 seconds. But you can do that. And here are some photos of some of the people we have already started to get those stories from. And they are powerful. But I think most people in sort of grassroots America aren't aware of that. So it'll be a start, anyway, to try to get those stories out there. Yeah, science ought to be part of the solution. Science is struggling right now with distrust. And then faith should be an anchor in the storm. There's all kinds of exhortations about what we, as people of faith, I pick a few here from the New Testament, love your neighbor as yourself, and even love your enemies, and pray for those who persecute you. And the words of Jesus, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. How are we doing, Christians? Not so good. We should be in the best position to advocate against divisiveness and animosity and vitriol, and in favor of love, grace, and truth. But at least what you see portrayed and the way in which politics has infected many churches, I don't think we're living up to these exhortations like we need to. And then there's trust, which is kind of ungirding all of this. And this is pretty disturbing when you look what happened over the last 50 years. Trust in everything has been shrinking. And the only exception being the military. Things that were at least getting 50% or close to that of trust are now down in sort of 10 or 20%. And that certainly includes trust in science, although trust in science is still a little higher than trust in scientists. How do we decide how to trust something anyway? This is sort of matter for a little introspection. How do we decide? I think we decide on 4 criteria. Is the source one with integrity? Are they competent? Have they done the work? Do they know? And are they humble? Are they willing to say, I don't know everything, I just know about this thing that you asked me about? But there's this 4th one. Does that source align with my values? And that's always been there. But now, it's like everything. And so you may find yourself willing to accept a statement from a source that frankly is not all that credible or full of integrity and humility, but it's part of your bubble, it's part of your tribe. Okay, must be right. Whereas something coming at you from that other tribe that you don't necessarily like, and you certainly don't like those people, you're going to dismiss it without asking the question, wait a minute, is that a credible source that I really need to learn from? We're doing a lot of that. So how do we get over this? How do we find our way back? Let's not make this totally gloomy. What are some positives that we the people might be able to take action on? Well, I think it is up to us. The politicians and the media are not going to solve this. I'll give you some pointers. First, figure out what is your worldview. I hope it is not to make a lot of money, and that's it. I hope it is not to be somebody who has achieved power. I think it's got to be a life of meaning, and meaning doesn't come from money and power. It comes from service and love for your neighbor and taking care of the least of these when you see the opportunity to do so. My book club recently reread Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. If you have not read that, you should do so. His description of life in a concentration camp during the Nazi reign and what he learned from that. And then his exhortations to all of us about that search for meaning as the fundamental thing we're here for. That's what you're here at a university to do. Somebody asked me, what's the number one role that a university should take on right now? Help the students find meaning in the path that they've chosen. Okay, find that worldview. Do a better job, given that we are overtaken by our tendency to decide whether the source is aligned with our values. Put that aside and make sure you're distinguishing facts from fakes, and social media may not be your friend. Engage with family and friends outside your bubble. More listening, less shouting. Here's where Braver Angels has been a big source of learning for me by joining this organization, which Carl mentioned. And lower right there, you'll see me in a debate in front of 700 people with a trucker from Minnesota who was absolutely furious about the way in which COVID was handled by the public health organizations, and had some very good points that I kind of had to listen to, that we were not really considering what life was like outside of the big cities at the beginning, because that's where the greatest tragedy was. And we didn't have an easy way to do so, but we were not seen as being listeners at that point. Seek out community opportunities for dialogue, not just one at a time, but move that into a community, and a church is a good place. And yeah, it'd be good if our national leaders could actually stand up for character and vision and positive action instead of just arguing all the time. And then if you want to accept my challenge that the solution here is not the politicians or the media, it's you, well, maybe sign a pledge. If you have your camera, take a snapshot of the QR code. This will take you to Braver Angel's website, where there is a possible pledge called the Road to Wisdom Pledge that you could think about whether you want to make a decision to be part of the solution. It's pretty simple. It's not, I think, things that you will find particularly difficult to agree to, but it's still a moment of saying, okay, I am really going to try to attach myself to such things as seeking out opportunities to engage in dialogue with people who have different views instead of avoiding them. Being a wise consumer, not sharing information, not being part of the going viral of something that's a lie, and then being generous in your spirits with other personal interactions. So that was a lot. And yes, there is this book, The Road to Wisdom, but I can't tell you that I'm necessarily the perfect source for that. If you really want to find wisdom, there's lots of other places. There's a whole wisdom literature. There are courses taught in wisdom literature. Go and take some of those. And for me as a Christian, a lot of the wisdom that I rely on comes from the book of Proverbs or from these two verses from the book of James. And I love these, and it's one that, in this instance, you see decorated by my daughter, who knew that I loved this enough to a lot of work to make this into a work of art. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men generously and without reproach, and it will be given him. But then there's a nice second part of this, which says what that wisdom is like. It's pure. It's peaceable, it's gentle, it's reasonable, it's full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. And you just have to ask, and that wisdom can come to you as well. My prayer for all of us is that we will figure out in these difficult times to recognize that we are still on the right side of history by standing up for things like truth and goodness and beauty and the value of science and the importance of figuring out how to apply our trust in a fashion that actually brings us forward. And I think we can do that. And history will look back on this time as a bit of a strange aberration from which we learned and ultimately recovered. But I am an optimist. So you got to help me by taking on some of this challenge yourself to be part of the solution. And I can't think of a better place to have that happen than in a university like Thomas Jefferson's University of Virginia. Thank you all. Okay, and thank you, Jenny has brought me cards, and there are multiple different handwriting here, so I know she didn't write them all herself. And I'll just run through here. Do you think anything could have been done to avoid some of the politicalization of science and discovery? Yeah, probably. Again, when I look at what happened during COVID, yes, there were politicians who were using their influence to spread information that was demonstrably false, and that was really bad. And there were people on the internet who were doing the same, and some of them making money off of it. But there were also people like me in front of television cameras trying to tell people what exactly was going on. And I wish at every one of those we'd have said, you know, I'm going to give you the best information I have right now, but I might be wrong, because this is an evolving story. This is how science works. We're still collecting data. We don't know enough yet to be sure that you should put that mask on or that social distancing, a certain distance matters. And we are not even quite sure whether the vaccines, now that you've taken them, are going to need a booster, because we didn't know for a while about how durable it was going to be. And we didn't know about the fact that this virus was going to keep mutating into new viruses, and we'd have to start over again with Omicron. All of that was happening along the way, but people didn't know it was coming. And I wish if we had a parallel universe I could go back to, that we could be more clear about that so that it would not come as a shock when a few weeks later it sounded like you were hearing a totally different recommendation. So yeah, all of those things played into it. I do think, and this is not intended to be a terrible rap on our school system, but I do think a lot of people came to that pandemic and have been gradually coming to that without a good base of critical thinking. If our K through 12 situation was more focused on critical thinking and civics instead of teaching for the tests for something else, then we might have had a public that was a little better prepared and would be better prepared now for these difficult challenges. Dr. Collins, as someone who is at the center of what is communicated at the public institutional level and what is accepted by Americans in the privacy of their own minds, how, in your own words, do you explain the increasing disconnect? And do you find fault with the institutions, the individuals, or both? Well, there's overlap there a little bit. I think it's all of the above. Institutions have done things that have resulted in reduced trust. You can call that earned distrust. But a lot of the distrust is manufactured, oftentimes by people who have a malevolent desire to tear down that institution. And now our society has kind of become anti-institutional as a reflex, that you assume that anything that's an institution is probably on the take, probably not very competent, probably somehow populated by people who really should have retired a long time ago. But that includes institutions that you depend on every day and don't think about. So we have an issue here, just a mindset of our society, and that's conveyed by individuals. But some of it is institutions in their own way. Again, the maybe slightly reassuring news is I think people are really ready for a change. And people who study social media would say, there's something happening there. The outrage Olympics doesn't seem to be quite as appealing anymore. People are looking for something other than a message that's just going to make you mad or fearful. They're looking for something that's going to have more value. Hooray for that. Maybe this effort that I'm trying to do with stories about medical research will have a better chance because of that. But yeah, perhaps this is a phase we had to go through, like childhood, I don't know. But I hope if that's the case, that we've learned enough to figure out as a society how to turn it around. What part of mere Christianity do you find most impactful? The whole thing. It's such a well-argued, thoughtful, accessible book, written, of course, in the 1940s, but still just incredibly compelling. And I still go back to that first chapter about the moral law because that opened my eyes to things that I just hadn't thought about. You mentioned some of the strongest arguments against atheism. But what would you say the strongest argument against Christianity is for you? Great question. There are a few. There are aspects of things in the Bible that I have trouble with. There are, in the Old Testament, for instance, circumstances where it looks as if God is asking people to commit genocide. How is that an acceptable thing to do? And there's all kinds of answers to that. Don't worry if you're suddenly rattled by that statement. But it certainly is something to look at carefully and think about. Is Christianity consistent within its own sacred writings? I think the thing that turned me off most about Christianity when I was an atheist was Christians. And I wasn't able to distinguish the difference between what Christians were saying and what churches were like and what the real foundation of the Christian faith was all about. And going back to the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, really was an eye-opener. It is so different than what you will see carrying out now. What do you think happens when we physically die? Oh, a nice, simple one here as we're getting ready to wind down. I don't know. I'm really curious to know. And I will know. Jane Goodall was a dear, dear friend. And Jane and I would occasionally talk about this. And as you know, she died a few months ago. And she said, it's the greatest adventure. I can't wait to find out. I wasn't quite there, but I get the point. I do think as a person of faith that in my faith tradition, there seems to be lots of indication that death is not the end, that there is another opportunity there for an experience, an existence that is hard for me to be entirely clear that I understand. But Jesus dying on the cross says to the thief next to him, who has just basically admitted his own evil actions and asked forgiveness, and Jesus said, "You will be with me." That sounds like he's saying, yes, you're not going to be wiped out in the next couple of hours. But what exactly that experience is like, I'm just as uncertain as almost everybody. I do think the after-death experiences are interesting, but as a scientist, I can also kind of say, well, you know, funny things might be happening in neurons when you've lost oxygenation for a little while. I don't know. Are non-Christians wrong in their ideas about God? That depends on what their ideas are. When I've talked to many non-Christians, and I enjoy doing that, oftentimes I encounter somebody whose idea about God is a God I don't believe in either. It's a God that's been somehow formed by various other experiences, but doesn't seem to me to represent the God of the Bible. So I think part of it is just trying to figure out what idea is there. But I think we all have to admit the one thing you can't say about the question of God's existence is that it's not important, right? So it's probably a good thing to talk about, even if you're pretty sure you're on one side or the other. This should not be a taboo topic. What else can you point to that would be more important than whether God exists or not? As a Christian, a disappointed American citizen, a lover of science, and a retired homeschool mom, what can I do? A lot. You're in a great position to be part of the answer to this exhortation about we the people. Find those people that you sort of know and kind of now avoid because they seem to be on a very different place on important issues. Invite them for coffee or a glass of wine. Say, I would like to sit down with you and actually really listen enough to understand how you have arrived at your perspective. I want to respect you for that. And they'll be surprised, and they will probably be a little suspicious. But if you take that seriously, listen so well that you can say back, here's what I heard you say. And they then say, yeah, that's what I said. I had no idea you actually listened to me, because we've stopped doing that. Then you might have made a friend. One of the best friends I had, a period 12 or 13 years ago, was Christopher Hitchens, one of the very angry new atheists of that time, who wrote absolutely scathing takedowns of anybody who had a belief in God, especially Christians, and a book called God Is Not Great, and who I interacted with sometimes in public, which was not at all enjoyable because he was the master of the put-down, and occasionally in private, where he was a wonderfully warm, gentle guy. And he got cancer, and I ended up spending a lot of time in his last 2 years helping him negotiate through what was ultimately a fatal stage 4 esophageal cancer. But we did give him some extra time from a genomics trial. And I learned so much from him because he was so knowledgeable about the Bible. He could find the weaknesses in my arguments so quickly and go right there. And that was good for me to see. Iron sharpens iron. You have a chance to really figure out, okay, do I believe this? And if so, I better do some more work to be sure. So those kinds of interactions, you learn something, you expand. It's not like you're just, oh, I have to do this with this horrible person. You're going to spend time with that person. They won't be horrible anymore. And you will change them and they will change you. Not right away. And some of these will go really badly, let's be clear. Sometimes it just isn't going to happen. But a lot of times it will. And then enlarge that to a larger circle. Start a book club with people on opposite sides of an issue. Try to figure out how in your community there's a venue of some sort where these kinds of conversations can happen. Join Braver Angels. They've had events right here in the Rotunda. I looked that up. I'm not sure how long ago, maybe last fall. And they have chapters in Virginia and 100 and some chapters across the country. That is a great training ground to figure out how you can begin to get together with people who disagree with you. And all of their gatherings have to be 50-50 blues and reds. Can't be skewed one way or the other. And that way everybody feels safe. They're not going to be picked on or ganged up on because you've got like-minded people with you as well as those other folks. It is a really good learning experience. I know Braver Angels is also doing things at universities, particularly for that first week of freshman year, to try to have students learn those skills right from the get-go so you can apply them. Because I think that's a really good thing. So you make the most of your time in a place like the University of Virginia with that skill set of learning from other people and not being afraid to disagree, which for a while it seemed like everybody was afraid to do that. I think I've run through the cards unless there are any more. But we've run through the time. Well, okay, there might be one more thing. There seems to be a guitar over there. Did you all notice that already? Well, okay. And this guitar, I should point out, was made in Stanton, Virginia, at the Husson Dalton Luthier, a wonderful group of artisans there. This is Adirondack spruce on the top, derived from the Blue Ridge Mountains. Oh yeah, and there is a double helix on the fretboard, maybe you noticed that too. This guitar has a name, because guitars should have a name. I hope I'm doing this right here. We're going to try to make this appropriately balanced. Are we good? Okay. Yeah, you know, DNA, Watson and Crick, you would think. Is this Watson or Crick? No. Remember how they figured out the double helix? There was some data that had to be looked at. And it was looked at by Jim Watson when the person who generated the data was not aware that was happening. And that was Rosalind Franklin. This is Rosalind. So this is a sing-along, y'all. I should have warned you ahead of time, but it's too late. Lock the doors. They're not letting out now. It's a song by Carrie Newcomer, who's a wonderful folk singer that I met in person at this folk festival that my parents started. They did a lot, you know, theater and music. And I fell in love with this song. And I've kind of rewritten it from time to time to fit the occasion, including this one. But it's basically an exhortation to we the people. If there's an issue now that needs attention, don't let somebody say, well, maybe not you, maybe it's not the time. Your response to that is, if not now, tell me when. And that's most of the words to the chorus, which I'm going to teach you. So if you just know, if not now, tell me when, you got it, except for the third line, which is, we may never see this moment or place in time again. This was written 20 years ago, but it felt like it was intended for right now. So here's how the chorus goes. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. We may never see this moment or place in time again. If not now, tell me when. Got that? If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. We may never see this moment or place in time again. If not now, tell me when. I see sorrow and trouble in this land. I see sorrow and trouble in this land. Although there will be struggle, we'll make the change we can. If not now, tell me when. Come on now, y'all. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. We may never see this moment or place in time again. If not now, tell me when. So we'll work until it's done. Every daughter, every son, every soul that ever longed for something better. something brighter. All together now, there's nothing we can't do. All together now, there's nothing we can't do. Though sometimes we grow weary, love and hope will see us through. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. Oh, we may never see this moment or place in time again. If not now, tell me when. We're here to say that broken things can mend. We're here to say that broken things can mend. When we all come together, then hope will always win. This is when, UVA, this is when. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. We may never see this moment or place in time again. If not now, tell me when. When we all come together, then hope will always win. This is when, UVA, this is when. This is when, UVA, this is when.